was going to ask you about your ideas around the yield curve, because right now people are either ignoring the curve or just saying that it's dead.
Well, I think it's a combination of the two, right? I mean, you have to somewhat ignore it. And again, I think that this is a challenge. I encourage people to go to the conference board and take a look at their most recent reports on leading economic
Yeah,
indicators.
right.
It's always a great resource, by the way. And so it's the conference board. They put out a monthly report on leading economic indicators, coincident economic indicators, et cetera. Those are signaling a very clear recession, both that we've come through and that is ultimately ongoing in terms of the depth of the drawdown in leading economic indicators. And that's even more compelling when you consider that about 3 of the 10 leading economic indicators that are used are things like the price behavior of the S&P 500 or credit spreads, which are very tight, or various other components, right? And it has been through a record contraction without a designation of unemployment. And the reason I would argue that that's happening is because we have a very different environment than we've had for really the past 50 years. The baby boomers are finally making it into retirement, right? Or at least in size. And so we're seeing a collapse in the number of workers between 55 and 65. It's actually falling for the first time because my generation, Gen X, I think you're the same generation, George.
Yeah, yeah.
The Gen X generation, who nobody even remembers to put on, various polls. Do we even exist, sort of
They go
thing,
right
right?
from the millennials to the boomers.
Exactly. No, well, I mean, that's all that matters, right? And so, we're this population bust, as are our children. So, my children range in age from 19 to 23 years old. And they come through a period, they were all born in a period of relative population bust in which there was also a relatively low level of immigration. And you're seeing that impact all sorts of things. But among the most interesting one is, again, we're seeing a contraction in the 18 to 24 working population, a contraction in the 55 to 64 working population. And then right in the middle there, you've got the relatively productive. I know that's not the way we normally describe them, but you've got the millennials that are sitting right there in the center, and they're making the transition to, I think the technical term is knowing what the hell they're doing in the workforce,
All right.
right? They've kind of made it past the point that they had too many tattoos and worked too many hours or too few hours, perhaps at Starbucks as a barista. And now they're suddenly turning on their entrepreneurial juices and recognizing that, the world may be a slightly different place. But all that's happening at the same time is they're struggling with the unaffordability of housing, the lack of having children, right? The fecundity or the fertility rates have just absolutely collapsed, as something I think you've probably heard me talk about, is underway, which is what I call the Italianization of America, right? We're segmenting into a population that doesn't relocate nearly as frequently, where the advantages of staying in the local town where your family is from because you have preferential access to housing, or you happen to know people in the community better, and that creates a support network for you, that allows you to get away with all sorts of stuff that you otherwise might not be able to do had you decided to hop into a Conestoga wagon and make your way across the Western Plains. We're suddenly looking at a situation in which it's just safer and more profitable to stay in the same place. And
That's
as a
interesting.
result,
It's
if
interesting
you,
you say that, Mike, because I live in Colombia, in Medellin,
yep.
and that's exactly how people live here.
Mhm.
You'll go down to, one of the strata 3 places, a neighborhood, and you'll have a family, and the grandparents live just right across the street,
Yep.
and their cousins live right across that. Like the whole family lives on the entire block, and they wouldn't go anywhere else. And it's their form of a financial safety net.
Absolutely correct. This is what most Americans can't fathom about places like Europe. If you look at Italy or Greece, you saw periods of unemployment where unemployment rates would hit 20%, right? Or youth unemployment rates would be over 50%. And in many ways, we look at that from an American perspective and say, how could that possibly be, right? How could half the people not have jobs? And the answer is, well, that's just the same thing as a stay-at-home wife, right? I mean, half the people in the household don't have jobs, right?
Right.
Why? Because you've created a personal social safety net, a familial safety net that allows people to get away with that type of behavior. And
So
there's pros and there's cons associated with it.
yeah, so you think that the low unemployment rate is due to labor force participation?
I think it's a combination of low population growth and labor force participation, right? It's just not reasonable to expect 75-year-olds or 80-year-olds to work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Although they might have, we would expect to see them take various roles that we would describe as work for other people, right? The easiest one would be, well, just, provide babysitting services for grandchildren so that your children or even great grandchildren, babysitting services so that they can actually your grandchildren can now go out to work, et cetera, right? We see this across communities that have high degrees of unemployment and traditional measures of instability. The family network steps in, the extended family network steps in as a social safety net. And again, we're just seeing extraordinary evidence that this is the case in the United States.
What do you think that means for housing?
Well, I think it means a couple of things, right? I mean, if you're going to create a multi-generational household, that house very well may never hit the market. But if it
Mm.
does, it may very well never find a buyer, right? And I'm sure you see this. Again, you said Colombia, Maine, and that it's very similar to Italy. The irony is if you go to Italy and if you were to try to buy a nicer home in a tourist destination, Tuscany or Rome or Milan or even Naples, you'd likely find that that's extremely expensive. But if you
Yeah.
go to the more rural areas of Italy, they've been under depopulation pressures for decades. And as a result, you have abandoned farmhouse properties that they're begging, even in some city areas, right? Some formerly robust cities that have seen this depopulation characteristic. And Maine, by the way, I think has been experiencing depopulation in one form or another since I think it was 1850 or something. It's gone through waves where it's increased and decreased, but Maine was one of the very first places, whereas, the West was one and the American continent was taken over from the Native Americans. You saw people in Maine be like, well, why would I scrabble farming existence out of this rocky soil and, very short growing season when I can go to Nebraska and get wide open fields, right? You very rapidly found that Maine was an unattractive place from an agricultural standpoint. It then had a turn due to water resources as a bit of a textile factory. And then, now it's basically tourism, as I understand it.
Yeah, I think the
Tourism
key
and
there,
and,
the key,
and LL Bean boots, but yeah.
yeah, I think the key is when we look at the real estate market, we're always looking at inflows and outflows of population as one of the
Yep.
main drivers. But people also need to realize that if their incomes just aren't keeping up with the cost of living, you'll have the same dynamic play out by people moving in with one another. So
Yes.
even though the population isn't going down, there's more people per square foot. And
Right.
therefore, that could increase supply above and beyond demand.
Yeah, I mean the traditional model of an increase in how members per household has been a function of the number of children, but that's actually changed, right? In the past 20 years, really since the global financial crisis, we've begun to see a tremendous rise in multi-generational households, and it is meaningfully impacting it. The other thing that I think is really important for people to understand is, we talk about home prices and we talk about how much a home sold for. We don't pay any attention to the house that will never sell, right? The decrepit, abandoned house. I'm sure you have one, somewhere in Columbia, Maine that you drive by and you're like, wow, what a shame that that house has been allowed to fall into that disrepair. Well, the reason why that happens is because, your child leaves. You don't have the younger people there. You have an older person who's on a fixed income who just can't afford to maintain the house or doesn't have the physical capability to maintain the house as the community deteriorates around them. So nobody's there to offer the services and say, hey, I'll do it for you just because. And then the other thing to remember is that when you have an area that has lower income, and I'm thinking about, areas that are formerly agricultural or rural in their construction, if I'm going to buy windows for my home, windows are sold across the country at roughly the same price in institutions like Home Depot. So if I'm in a poor community, I can't afford to replace the window. Whereas if I'm in a really wealthy community, my only thought is like, wow, how badly am I being screwed by the, semi-skilled labor that's coming to make this installation? the window itself ceases to be the issue, whereas in the rural or exurban community, formerly agricultural or lower income community, the actual hardware itself, the physical window, the new door, the paint can actually become real barriers to maintaining the
Mm.
housing stock. And that deterioration in turn then means that when somebody does want to move somewhere or move into those communities, they have to build new. And perversely, that building new is going to cost just as much in Maine, if not more, because it has fewer, it's less history or less resources in terms of a deep building base, in terms of labor resources, meaning that it actually gets even harder, right? And so, like this is what you've seen in Italy. This is what you're beginning to see in the United States. And again, there can be pros. There can be an improvement in quality of life, and we are seeing some evidence of that from millennials. I will tell you, as a Gen Xer, my wife and I are now empty nesters. We've actually sold our home. We're traveling around the country and debating where we want to be next. And one of the fun things to do is actually go and look at the homes that have been designed by millennials in terms of their interior design capabilities, et cetera. Man, these guys know how to live. They've got
Mm.
great design taste. It's a heck of a lot better than our generation had.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny. I used to be into these Airstreams. I don't know if you
Yep.
know what those are.
I know. Yeah. The trailer.
Yeah, back in
Trailer.
2016, 17, I had a couple of them and I was remodeling them. And I
Yep.
noticed on eBay, the people that were flipping them, that were remodeling them and flipping them,
Yep.
almost all were kind of millennials. And,
Yes.
and they just made them spectacular inside.
Absolutely.
Really, really impressive.